Everyone, thanks for joining us. Good evening. Thanks for joining us. My name is Daniel Bowker. I'm a forester with a local watershed coalition called the Coalition for the Poudre River Watershed. I'd like to welcome you all tonight to talk about the new Black Diamond Forest Service project on behalf of the Northern Colorado Fireshed Collaborative. The Fireshed, as we call it, is a collaborative of all the agencies and organizations here in Northern Colorado that are working on wildfire mitigation, forest health, and watershed resilience. And we're excited to have a bunch of folks from the Forest Service with us here tonight, as well as representatives from NRCS and the Conservation District, local Larimer Conservation District. And we're going to hear a lot about the Black Diamond Resiliency Project. At this point, I'd like to turn it over to Dennis Kuhnel, the new District Ranger, and we'll hear what the Forest Service has to say. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Dennis Kuhnel, and I am the District Ranger on the Canyon Lakes Ranger District. I would like to welcome you all to our meeting this evening, and I would like to thank you all for participating. We deeply value your participation, and we look forward to all of your comments. We have a fantastic presentation prepared for you this evening by our Canyon Lakes and Arapahoe Roosevelt Pawnee staff, and we hope you all enjoy it. And then afterwards, of course, there'll be an opportunity for comment and question for clarification. So again, welcome you all. Good evening. And with that said, I will turn it over to our staff. Thank you.
All right. Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you all for being here, of course, and thank you to our partners and the Northern Colorado Fireshed for helping facilitate this stuff and their continued coordination on the project as well. My name is Jonathan Grand. I am the silviculturist. You can think of that as a forest ecosystem specialist. I'm also one of the project leads, along with Jonathan Markovich, who will be speaking here shortly as well. Next slide, please. So for our agenda, we had our welcome. We will have a brief overview of the project and the environmental planning process, as well as how to engage with the project. And that's really the major goal for the Forest Service from tonight's meeting, is to not only present an overview of the project and where to find additional resources and information, but to also make sure that the opportunity for formal and continued engagement is made clear and available to all of you. So we welcome your questions. We want to provide information on how to engage with the project throughout its development, such as with scoping, which is happening now. And we'll talk about that a little bit more on commenting for the project proposal, as well as throughout our analysis stage, and especially in prioritizing and planning specific risk reduction projects when it comes to implementing the project. We have a pretty varied group of specialists available from the Forest Service tonight. We ask that you save your questions towards the end, or there is a Q&A option, and we can address them through that. But we have a pretty broad range of specialists available to answer a range of questions specific to Black Diamond. If we can't answer a question in detail or a specialist isn't available, that we'll happily answer your or take your information and follow up with you. Or you can capture that as a comment through our commenting webpage if that avenue feels more appropriate. Next slide, please. This is the overview of the project area. It's approximately 266,000 acres, including all jurisdictions. So it's north of the Cameron Peak fire footprint. So the south border of this purple polygon there is the north boundary of the Cameron Peak fire footprint. And so the project boundary follows that. East from our Rawa Wilderness all the way to our east administrative boundary up to the Colorado-Wyoming border. There's a myriad of different jurisdictions and lands in there. Forest Service comprises the majority of those lands. It's at about 190,000 acres, while private land makes up the second largest component of that landscape at 67,000 acres, with 600 acres of state lands or other governmental lands. And next slide, please. So this landscape and at this scale is highly variable. From ponderosa pine woodlands at our lowest elevations in lower montane, you can see that in the upper right corner of the screen, ranging into mixed conifer forest, which is ponderosa pine, Douglas fir, and a mix of other conifer species, which is in that upper montane box in the lower right, all the way up into our subalpine forest, which is mostly spruce, fir, and lodgepole pine. And within these forests, they all have different historical fire regimes, and they've all evolved with fire in very unique and different ways. From in the lower montane in that ponderosa pine woodland area, generally we would have more frequent fires of less severity and in smaller size. And then as we go up in elevation through the montane into that subalpine, we would get into higher severity fires that would occur over longer periods of time. So several hundred years between fires that would burn with higher severity. And along with that complexity is a complex change in different conditions. And that includes fuels and forest structure conditions, the human environment and human development, insect and disease outbreaks, increasing recreational use, and an overall departure from historical conditions that would have supported a natural fire regime and expected fire conditions. And so all of this couples together in creating an environment that's conducive to repeated large-scale catastrophic wildfire events. And that tends to be exacerbated when we start looking at things like potential climate futures and pressures from that. And so to treat and manage that sort of scale and that complexity, we need a range of management tools to restore forest conditions and reduce the risk of wildfire to key forest resources. And that includes things like communities and infrastructure, as well as our underrepresented forest conditions, such as old growth. So a goal of this project is to clearly lay sideboards that are founded in the best available science and research in science on what mechanisms or tools can be used and in what combination to achieve our goal, and how activities might be mitigated to prevent additional or unwanted impacts from those actions on other resources. Next slide, please. And so in that context, when the Forest Service and partners and we began looking at this landscape, three major needs were identified, and that's to improve and maintain a resilient landscape, which includes actions that serve to promote forest conditions that replicate fire-adapted ecosystems, as well as improving the diversity and resilience of vegetative communities. The next major theme is improving, creating, and facilitating fire-adapted communities, which involves actions to reduce hazardous fuels in and adjacent to high-risk resource areas, and engaging communities and other partners to collaboratively plan and implement these projects across boundaries, and to promote community wildfire protection plans and encourage support to those communities to develop those plans and support actions in communities that are already developing those plans. And then the last one is to improve wildfire response, which is really directed at implementing prescribed fire and improving wildfire response safety and efficacy. And so it's important to consider both the ecology and the human environment, such as communities and recreation sites and roads and other infrastructure. And so in addition to a resilient forest, we want our communities within the project area to be adapted to fire as well. And tying to the improving, creating, and facilitating fire adapted communities, a lot of good work is already coming out of communities within this footprint, with Glacier View having just recently completed a CWPP, and I believe beginning to move into the implementation phase, and Crystal Lake's doing good work to finalize their CWPP and engaging partners and these types of projects as well. So not just developing those plans, but engaging across jurisdictions to look at how we can support those efforts as well, or how our efforts can serve to support those actions across boundaries. And so ultimately, we're looking to strategically manage vegetation in areas to better support the implementation of prescribed fire, restore forest conditions, and reduce fuels.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jonathan Markovich. I'm the Forest Environmental Coordinator here on the Arapahoe and Roosevelt. I'm going to talk a little bit about the planning process for the Black Diamond project over these next series of slides. So as Jonathan mentioned, there's a big emphasis on working across boundaries with this project. In the past, when we've completed work on National Forest System lands, this work would typically stop at the boundary. So the landscape may have looked more like that left-hand diagram there. We recognize, given the scale of the challenge and the scale of conditions we're seeing, that we need to work with our neighbors across property boundaries to plan for a more cohesive approach. So this project's approach will allow us to identify specific proposals that are generated through partnerships with the larger landscape in mind. Projects will tie work together across public and private lands. And while we won't be implementing the work on the other side of the boundary line, it's through the partnership that we have with groups like the NOCO Fireshed, Coalition for the Poudre River Watershed, American Forest Foundation, Colorado State Forest Service, NRCS, and the Conservation District. And that will help us complete this vision. So trying to emphasize here that the Black Diamond Project is integrating with our partners and community members to collaboratively plan and implement cross-jurisdictional landscape scale forest projects in the project area, with the goal of preparing the landscape and communities to receive wildfire as a part of the ecosystem. We'll prioritize management decisions with our partners by setting priorities together and combining our mutual skills to achieve the outcomes we all desire. And how do we achieve this vision? So the Forest Service is beginning the planning process that will give us the tools and authorization to begin strategically implementing management actions on National Forest System lands and in collaboration with our adjacent landowners. So we recently released our proposed action and project documents. And in that, we identify the purposes and needs of the project, some of which Jonathan's already covered. We're looking to improve forest resilience to wildfires and disturbance by using our tools to move our ecosystem towards desired conditions that are appropriate for each forest type. Reforestation will be considered in areas such as those affected by recent wildfires or future wildfires. And as part of increasing resilience, we're looking to restore fire dynamics by reintroducing fire to the landscape and allow it to serve its natural roles. The use of prescribed and managed fire on the landscape helps restore natural disturbance patterns while creating a diverse mosaic of habitat types. We're looking to bolster our communities to be adapted to and prepare for wildfires that are likely to occur. We'll utilize management actions to maximize community safety and fire suppression effectiveness with the goal of reducing risk of high-intensity wildfires that would negatively affect our communities and infrastructure. We'll employ management actions within the wildland-urban interface, or WUI, and along potential operational delineation, or POD boundaries, to decrease potential fire behavior and facilitate fire control opportunities. Now, pods and pod boundaries might be a newer term to some of you. Pods are essentially containers that are drawn on a map that are defined by potential fire control features such as roads and ridgetops. And these containers can be used to summarize risks to landscape values in a way that's useful for communicating and coordinating response to wildfires before they occur. So the goal would be to pre-plan and manage vegetation along pod boundaries so it's ready to be used or needs less work during wildfire operations to slow or stop the spread of the fire. So when we talk about WUI mitigation or pod boundaries, we identify in our proposal that these are areas we're emphasizing for risk reduction. As you can see on the map, there's a mix of private and non-federal lands across the landscape, and this highlights the need to manage vegetation differently to promote conditions that reduce or mitigate the risk of wildfire negatively impacting these communities. So our proposal would allow land managers to identify and apply the right management tools for the right place at the right time. We're looking at the needs of the larger landscape and identifying a suite of tools that we could employ. Some of the tools in our toolbox would include manual and mechanical thinning and prescribed fire, both pile burning and broadcast burning, to increase resilience. We would prioritize hazardous fuels reduction, both by mechanical and manual means in the WUI to promote fire adapted communities. We propose managing vegetation along those pod boundaries to create areas for safe wildland fire response. And so multiple management actions could be employed in the landscape, and they're included in our proposal. And those would be applied in areas that are currently out of alignment with our desired conditions. We'll work with our resource specialists and our partners to identify the right tool from the toolbox, given the conditions we see on the ground, where and when we're planning to do the work. The full list of management actions are included in our project documents, which we'll talk about in a bit. So to better respond to changing conditions on the ground and take advantage of opportunities to work with partners and adjacent landowners more readily, we're proposing a different approach to planning, analysis, and management. Our past planning process identified smaller areas for management actions and typically went through the process you see on the top there, from analysis to implementation. And while this is a valid approach, the entire process can take a long time. And if conditions change on the ground before implementation is completed, land managers are restricted to what was in a project decision and couldn't easily adapt to those change conditions. In addition, moving from one project to the next meant we had to start back at the beginning of the process on the next area. And the result is we didn't close this loop as frequently as we could. And as we've seen from recent wildfires, we know we have big challenges. And so we're thinking of a different solution in our planning approach to address those challenges. So we're looking at and analyzing a larger landscape, completing the NEPA process, and then we'll be selecting smaller priority areas that will implement management actions collaboratively and following the sideboards of the decision. This approach is going to enable us to be more flexible in implementing actions and respond to changing conditions on the ground. We'll be able to close this loop more frequently by having most of the analysis completed up front, while maintaining public engagement and necessary site-specific surveys during implementation. That means if there's an area identified to get work going with adjacent landowners or partner agencies, once we have this decision and our tools identified, the Forest Service will be able and ready to collaborate on projects more effectively. And if conditions change in a particular area after we've reached our decision, we'll already have the tools authorized to address that change condition. So our proposal is an analysis follows the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA process. As a federal agency, we must comply with NEPA. Now, we've already spent a lot of time collaborating with our partners and our Forest Service specialists to develop our proposal, as you see on the left side of this triangle. Now we're rounding the corner into environmental analysis, and that begins with scoping. So we've released our project documents and we're hosting these meetings to inform the public and give you an opportunity to ask questions. But gathering public feedback early on and prior to analysis is important to make sure that we're on the right track. And so we can use your feedback to steer the project during analysis as we work towards a decision. So we're accepting comments for 2 weeks on the proposal until September 20th, and then we'll work with our resource specialists to analyze effects of our actions, seek ways to minimize or avoid those effects. We'll also be publishing a draft environmental assessment and accepting comments on that draft EA and effects analysis. After we have that comment period, we'll make any adjustments based on public comments and then present the findings to our decision maker, Dennis, you saw earlier, to make a decision. We're expecting to have our draft decision ready in 2023, after which we'll hold an objection process prior to issuing a final decision in the summer of 2023. Now for the scoping period, we're encouraging you to start with the interactive story map that was developed by CPRW and the Forest Service. You can use this link here. I believe you can actually click it right from the screen. The story map has information on the project area, our vision, and the Black Diamond project proposal. Towards the bottom of the story map, there's a link to our documents and the comment form, which will accept comments through September 20th. And just to re-emphasize, we're currently in the scoping period, which is seeking your input on our preliminary proposal, and we will also have a comment period on our draft environmental assessment anticipated for early 2023. So the story map will link you to our Forest Service webpage where the documents can be found. The links are also here for anyone interested. We're encouraging you to start with the scoping letter document. This is a letter from our Canyon Lakes District Ranger, Dennis, explaining the project and an overview of the proposal. Information about the scoping period and how to comment is also included. We then recommend that you look at the Black Diamond proposed action document. This has details on our purposes and needs for the project, a summary of our proposed actions, and supporting rationale. A few other documents to highlight are Appendix A, the management activity cards. This appendix details possible management actions that may be implemented individually or in combination to achieve our project objectives and desired future conditions. This appendix seeks to provide additional descriptions of management activities and conditions for their use. Appendix B contains project design features which constrain our management actions to protect resources, minimize effects to acceptable levels, or avoid effects altogether. For any action we would implement on National Forest System lands, we'd be required to follow these design features. A few examples are if we know there's an active raptor nest in the area where we're proposing to do work, we may need to limit our operations to a specific time period to avoid disturbing those nesting raptors. Another example is applying a buffer to exclude ground disturbing activities around perennial streams or streams containing threatened or endangered species so that we reduce sediment going into streams from our work. And as we continue through analysis, these design features will continue to evolve as we gain a better understanding about potential effects and adjust accordingly to minimize or avoid those effects. And then Appendix C contains several maps about the project area and different conditions we see out there and what our forest transportation system looks like. So as I mentioned, we're accepting comments during the scoping period through September 20th, which is next Tuesday. To submit a comment from the main Forest Service webpage, there's a link on the right-hand side that says comment/object on project. That would take you to a web form where you can type your comment in or attach a comment letter and submit it for our consideration. Now, some questions to keep in mind as you're writing your comments. These are very helpful suggestions for the Forest Service. We want you to be thinking about, is this the type of work that you'd like to see on the landscape? Do you support the purposes and needs that we've identified to improve, for example, to improve forest resilience? Is there a specific area that you think needs work within the project area? Are we missing any information that's not included? Or is any of the information confusing or hard to understand, and can we help clarify that? And then comments that generally won't help steer the course of the project include comments about work outside the project boundary, comments about other types of activities that aren't included in the proposal and don't support or address our purposes and needs, and comments that lack supporting information or rationale. And so we're looking forward to your feedback. Again, our scoping period on our initial proposal closes September 20th. So please submit your comments by next Tuesday using that comment form we just talked about. And that's the end of our overview presentation. We have about 35 minutes left with you all, and we have our resource specialist available. If anyone has any questions, can you please put them in the question and answer pod, and then we'll work to get those addressed. I don't believe I'm seeing any in there currently.
No, and I was going to say also, if folks, you know, you can also raise your hand and can be unmuted to ask your questions if you're more comfortable that way as well.
Okay, I see questions coming in now. Okay. So I see a question came in from Molly Pitts asking what role does the timber industry play in implementing the purpose and need? I can address this one. So as we've identified in the project, I believe in our implementation section, we're looking at all possible tools to help us achieve this work, whether that's a timber sale, an agreement with a partner that can help us implement some of these management actions, contract work, our own Forest Service crews and staff. So timber sales are definitely one of the tools in the toolbox to achieve this work. Okay. See another question from Peter. Are you planning on scoping the private land within the project boundary? So I'll answer that. We've done extensive outreach with our partners as part of this scoping process on our initial proposal. So I know we've sent this out to hundreds of email addresses, and it's been posted on Nextdoor through some of our partners and residents that have seen the project proposal. So yeah, we've tried to reach out far and wide for scoping. We're also going to have an opportunity for comments during our draft environmental assessment. And then even into implementation, we're still going to be reaching out to adjacent landowners where we're proposing to do work and interested in identifying priorities for work with our partners and interested landowners.
Jonathan, I was going to jump in there real quick, and yeah, if I can rephrase, I know Peter, and I think I know what he's asking about there. You know, for the scoping there, does this mean you guys are looking at work on federal lands, or is this process going to allow the Forest Service to do any work on private lands? Maybe what he's getting at.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for clarifying. I have a very NEPA-centric mind, so scoping has a very specific meaning to me. Yeah, that's a good question. Generally, the work we're proposing is done on National Forest System lands by the Forest Service. I think there's some scenarios where we may enter into an agreement with an adjacent landowner to share resources and complete work on private, but generally, the Forest Service does work on National Forest System lands, but the intent of this project is to identify shared priorities. So if there's a community that is really excited about doing mitigation work on their lands, and there's forest system, national forest lands just outside the community, we're hoping to engage with them so that we can do work on our side of the boundary while they're doing work on their side. And so it's a bigger effect, bigger bang for the buck. I hope that addresses the question. Yeah, I'm seeing, Peter, you had an example about the Gunnison National Forest. Some of the agreements that I talked about, we do enter into agreements with a lot of organizations so they can complete work on National Forest System lands as well. So yeah, definitely looking at that as an option to help us get work done on Forest Service lands. Do any of the other panel members see a question that they'd like to jump in and take?
I can kind of get at, I think I just got the Q&A up, and I'm following up with Molly's second question with an estimate of number of acres that need some level of pretreatment. We don't have that specifically quantified, but the majority of the project priority is in that lower elevation stuff from about 7,800 feet up into like the mid 8,000 foot zone. And that's where through a lot of those communities are. That's also the area that we've identified the highest departure and the highest need for mechanical pretreatment in that ponderosa pine throughout its range before we can do prescribed fire. So that's another context as far as strategy is there's a combination of these actions as well to get to a desired condition. So a lot of these, particularly when we're in close proximity to infrastructure or communities or other values at risk, it's going to take several entries to get to a desired condition where we're in that maintenance mode. And a large part of that is going to be mechanical pretreatment. So whether that's service work or timber sale, it's going to be pretty varied, but there's going to be quite a bit of it. The specific acreage I don't have, but I'll continue to engage with you and your groups on that information as we start to kind of develop that purview of scope of work.
Thanks, Jonathan.
Looking at
Any
some
other-
of these other ones, sorry, I was going to see if Jonathan Gran wanted to address the old growth and whether there's been an old growth inventory done.
Yes, yeah, I don't see the question immediately, but I'll answer that and then I'll read it over. And if I miss something, I'll swing back around and answer. There is inventoried old growth, and the forest identifies different levels of old growth within that project boundary, and that includes existing old growth and also areas that are likely to transition into an old growth condition within the next century, essentially, when we did that analysis. A major part of that is recognizing that old growth is a key forest ecosystem and resource, and that's included as one of our resource values at risk. And so when we talk about management, we have specific detail in the proposal that'll direct what type of actions are in there, but it's generally going to be protecting or facilitating the old growth condition. So improving that or protecting that from risk of wildfire or other things like pruning to improve burning and other actions that are going to generate or facilitate a faster condition towards an old growth designation.
I was typing this in the chat. There was a question about, is this the first area where we're using condition-based management and planning for future wildfires? Has this model been a success in other areas or states? And are there opportunities outside of the defined area for a similar approach? So we do have a similar project on the Arapahoe and Roosevelt. It's on our Boulder Ranger district to the south, and that's called our St. Vrain Forest Health Project. That project's working with the St. Vrain Forest Health Partnership, the BOCO Fireshed, which is a smaller subset of the NOCO Fireshed. I'll put the link in the chat. And then the second question there, so many other national forest units have used a similar planning approach for compliance with NEPA. So this is not the first in the nation. It's been used pretty widely in the West, and it is a growing trend. Do any other panel members see a question that they're able to address? Maybe the question about the project boundary.
I do see that, yeah. So the question directs at the south end of the project area as being part of the Cameron footprint and why that wasn't included in this project's boundary, and so that we could maintain that as a treated area. So despite being, and I probably won't cover all aspects of the answer to that question, but despite being a broad landscape scale project, we are focusing on a landscape with a specific need that's really directed, I think, towards improving wildfire safety using that pod network and analyzing for that piece, and then also the community protection and infrastructure protection. So while we have a large footprint, we have a very focused strategic approach. I think those are things that are definitely worth considering as we move forward and we move past some of the post-fire recovery work and what does that landscape look like. But I think as far as when we tailored into the three pieces specifically that came out of the fire coalition, or cohesive strategy, sorry, that focus kind of brought us into that specific footprint to be able to clearly say what we wanted to do, what the concerns were, what the desired condition was, and analyze for that specific range of conditions. And if I missed anything, please, any of the other specialists, feel free.
I might take just a quick second to remind our panelists, if you have the Q&A and the chat open, Forest Service people are really used to using Teams, but we're working with our partners because we know the public is a lot more familiar with Zoom. So a little bit different for us on our end. So just a reminder to our panelist folks that way you can kind of see everything that's going on. And again, if folks want to raise their hand, that's cool too.
Yeah, I see a general question. I'm not sure I completely understand what it's asking, but Marion was saying in areas where there are houses, how will you handle these plans? So there's a couple ways to answer that, if I'm understanding it correctly. Generally, where there are houses, we've done some modeling to make sure that's captured within the WUI mitigation zone. So those areas would be prioritized for hazardous fuels reduction, so that they're not negatively impacted by, or so the risk that they're negatively impacted by a wildfire is reduced. That's kind of generally how the treatments will look around houses. As we implement projects where there are adjacent communities to either work that the Forest Service is planning, or if there's a community that wants us to prioritize work around their community, we're looking to engage with partners and adjacent neighbors collaboratively, so that we can do work on our side of the boundary as work is occurring, or closely followed by work on private land as well. So really trying to tie together those treatments on private and public lands to make a bigger impact.
Hey, Jonathan, the ADC, Charlie, could you read that question, and I'll see if I can answer that.
Yeah, Matt Urich, our lands and mineral staff, did answer it from the lands perspective, but the question was asking, saying that 87C on the north of the boundary, it seems like there's a disagreement around what ownership that is. So Larimer County doesn't recognize this as their road and refers us to the Forest Service. She's grateful, Marcia's grateful that we've identified the road within the WUI area. Will this be addressed as part of the project? I'm not sure if you have any more specifics on that road, if it's a pod boundary or.
Yeah, I think I'm familiar. This is Matt Champo, and I'm the prescribed fire and fuel specialist on the district. I think generally what I can speak to on any of the county roads or the main artery forest roads, for folks out there that are familiar with the project area or have driven on the roads, the overall plan, and it ties into pods, would be to take a really hard look at our higher level roads, the roads that are better for traveling on, and as a pod, we would build off those roads, and then link other roads together. I don't know if you recall seeing the map in the PowerPoint presentation, but again, 87C, I believe, up north would more than likely be a candidate. as well as ADC, some of the Pearl Beaver and Dead Man roads, main arteries through the forest would obviously be something, candidates, pod boundary candidates that we'd be looking at. So not overly familiar with 87, Charlie, but there's high likelihood that would be a pod boundary. There's a lot of them.
Just add real quickly to the roads discussion. So we do have some connected actions that we'd be doing in connection with vegetation management. So if there's an area where we want to do work, but the road needs to be improved to allow us to access it, that might be an action we would also take, is some road improvement or potential road reconstruction.
I'm happy. There's a question about clear cutting and whether or not we plan to do clear cutting, where it may occur, and the size limitations to that. So we took a very, very strategic approach to address what we identified as needs for the landscape. So a large part of that, and a lot of our historic clear cutting, is regeneration, harvest, and lodgepole pine, and for a range of different conditions captured under other decisions as well. With this project, the approach that we're taking is in that higher elevation lodgepole pine, and even the dry lodgepole pine and what we would call the upper montane, we're looking to focus primarily on improving wildfire safety or wildfire response safety and efficacy, and that's through the pod network. So I would really encourage in that activity card appendix to look at the conditions that we've tied to when and where and why we would do clear cutting. We've identified that if they do occur, they'd be between 5 and 40 acres, but largely what they're going to be is as an alternative, and there's a tier of these alternatives to support the pod network, and largely within that pod network. So not extending to full pod boundaries, operating within what we consider to be a pod boundary. And as an alternative, having considered other options first. For wildfire response and suppression, our preference is to do the shaded fuel break approach or thinning or some other combination other than regeneration harvest. It provides a better condition for burning, and it changes the function of that pod to a fuel break. And so really what we're trying to do is tear away from implementing clear linear features when we may have some other options that are going to be best suited to that strategic location. As far as size limitation, we are limiting to 40 acres. And again, that's pretty unlikely to come across an example where we would be extending beyond a pod boundary, specifically in the Mesic montane or the wet lodgepole pine, Mesic subalpine lodgepole pine.
So I see folks are typing responses to some of the other questions that are in there, and I don't see anything that's hasn't been covered or is being responded to. So if folks have other questions, please be sure to write those out in that chat box or to raise your hand. So we've still got 15 minutes here with you, so want to make sure that we get to any of your questions that you have.
I think while Mike is typing, we might touch on different components of the same question. So I might put some pieces in there to that too. Beetle kill plays very complex roles in this project and how it interacts with whether we determine one treatment over another. There's going to be treatments for beetle kill as hazard trees, continued with that, so as they occur along pod boundaries, where we're likely to have wildfire response or like fire personnel, or along other prescribed fire suppression lines. Again, this would be a good one to look in the activity cards where we identify things like hazard trees or sanitation or salvage, or those different types of components where we're going out and targeting dead specifically. And I think Mike might come on and answer.
Yeah, let me just answer that one, I guess. So it kind of depends whether, if it's mechanically treated, most likely we will remove the merchantable volume that's in those dead trees as best that we can. Whole tree log the rest into basically landing piles and burn those piles. And so that's what the plan is. And then in the hand portion of those units, the majority of those trees would be cut down. Those dead beetle, trees would be cut down, piled, and also burned. Now, within the areas that are treated as prescribed fire, that's not the same, answer. And I'll relay that over to Matt in terms of what that would look like. You would remove some of those beetle hit trees basically with the prescribed burning, but not all.
Yeah,
Hopefully that answers that question, but it really kind of depends what you're treating and where it's at. So if there's a way to remove the merchantable volume and we've got a transportation system, then the plan would be to remove whatever merch and pile whatever is not merch.
Thanks, Mike.
So we don't want to keep people long if they don't have questions, but definitely want to still be available for folks. So please, if there's any last things that you're dying to know, type that in. Oh, there's another one about pods.
Yeah. Rather than me reading what was on my slide, I'm curious if Champo or Wesley, I see you're on, would like to explain the pod boundaries.
Yeah, I can do that. Is this in a question? I'm not seeing it, but
Yeah,
anyway.
they're just asking if we could explain
Okay.
about pod boundaries again.
Okay, yeah, so pod boundaries basically from our viewpoint and the overarching goal of pod boundaries is it's basically a decision point. So we can pre-identify, areas on the landscape, and like Jonathan alluded to, roads, rivers, ridges, the R's, where we can do pre-treatment prior to any sort of event, namely a wildfire, to come up with tactics, operations prior to anything happening. Pods really, again, is topographical. And again, it offers us a chance to do the work before we have an incident. It also is a benefit because we can, once we get that work done or in the planning phase, we can offer up that information to our suppression folks, fire suppression folks, and they'll have the intel to be able to make decisions when it comes to a wildfire. So they can have that data in the back of their mind, and they could formulate a plan compared to or going off of what work we've done there or what intel we have from that pod boundary. It also allows us to do prescribed fire work because a lot of prescribed fire, the time it takes to do prescribed fire is really wrapped up in all the pre-work that we do. So a lot of these pods, if we identify areas that are in higher fire risk or benefit, namely in the WUI, and the wildland urban interface, it helps out prescribed fire and fuels from being able to identify those areas that need the treatment and prioritize them and actually have the work completed. And that just knocks down the time it takes to maybe go implement a broadcast burn. So yeah, pods are just think of it as a trigger point or some sort of action on the land that, that's before an incident starts.
And Jonathan, I saw you answered the question about keeping the public informed. They'll also be, as we move forward, the idea is that we hope the story map will be another place where we can post information throughout this project's life. So that's going to be a really good source of information, as well as our website. And then as we do implement different types of implementation on the landscape, we do have mailing lists that we try to maintain to make sure that we're reaching out to the public as much as possible. Particularly if there's going to be a lot of cutting going on next to a community, or of course with prescribed fire. So there's definitely various ways to get involved. And so that was one of them with the scoping project, but also, communication throughout the project's life is really important too.
So I'm not sure we answered the 87C Boulder Ridge conversation the one about whether this project will deal with that road system when it comes to jurisdictional stuff.
So Matt did type an answer in response to that individual and provide, and I think got his email, or he's got her email address, I believe, for follow-up. So. Well, while we're waiting, if anyone else has anything else, just a reminder that this was recorded. And so Megan, who helped set this up for us with the Coalition for the Poudre River Watershed, will be emailing a link to the recording. So if you have neighbors or friends, others in your community that might want to hear what was shared today, you can definitely forward that along. We'll have that posted so that they can see it. Just trying to get the word out to as many people as possible and encouraging that comment and engagement.
Thanks, Reagan. And just to let everyone know, that email will be coming from Eventbrite. So that it's your follow-up email after this webinar, and it comes within 24 hours. So just don't ignore any emails from Eventbrite if you are wanting that link. But we'll also add this recording to the story map for this Black Diamond project as well. So you should be able to find it in a couple of different spots.
So Dennis, I don't see anybody raising their hand or having any other questions. I don't know whether you want to wrap it up at all this evening.
No, hello everybody. No, thanks a ton. We are, like we said at the very beginning, we were all super excited to hear from everybody that called in tonight. There were a lot of great questions, a lot of great answers. As Reagan so accurately said, this is really just the beginning of the process. We hope to keep in touch and communication with everyone. If you do think of something that you would like to ask for more clarification about, or anything like that, always feel free to reach out to us with those questions or comments. And then most importantly, don't forget to follow our story map, or to keep in touch with us about how to post comments if you do have any more questions about that. So good night, and thanks again.